Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the resurgence of measles and a nearly 80% increase in cases this year alone. Fungal meningitis causing all manner of issues. A cat parasite being linked to psychosis in males. The development of metal hooks in a bloodworm. And the resumption of Large Hadron Collider experiments in the European Union. The timestamps for these news items can be found in the description box given below. Let's start with measles. Measles is a disease that at present should be relatively benign. That is, children are vaccinated early in life, and as a consequence, the severity and duration of measles is drastically reduced. The number of deaths is almost non-existent, and the side effects of infection are minimal. This is a very big thing. Prior to vaccinations, it could lead to life-altering scars, sterility, and other issues. This is one reason why anti-vaxxers' claims that vaccines do nothing are nonsense. We had measles under control for a very long time. Since at least the early 2000s, it was almost entirely eradicated. There were, occasionally, cases imported or exported from various countries. New York had a particularly high prevalence of measles being imported from people visiting Israel. Despite that, it wasn't very common in other parts of the world or other countries where vaccines are common. Generally speaking, there would be the occasional case that would crop up and it would need to be traced and tracked and people would have to figure out what happened. But it wasn't as big an issue. Since the start of last year, there have been 21 large outbreaks, that is of a scale that was big enough to be a concern. Just about all of them were in Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, so we know where they are and what the outbreaks tied to as far as geography goes. The problem is, why is it happening? Part of the theory is that from 2020 to present, the number of vaccinations for many different childhood diseases haven't been given, and this is due to lockdowns, logistical problems, and so on. There are other possibilities as well, such as reduced confidence in vaccines, difficulties on the global scale when it comes to delivery of health services, and a shortage of qualified staff. In this case though, measles is just the first disease, and may be the first one that we're going to see, emulated with other diseases such as yellow fever. So diseases we once had under control are now resurging because one other disease created the necessary cascade of effects that we will see the impact for possibly 10 years more. Next is more clinically oriented and looking at how a disease, particularly a fungal disease, can get through the blood-brain barrier and then have an effect causing meningitis. Generally speaking, most medication and pathogens struggle to get through the blood-brain barrier. It is very effective. It's also why some medications have to be given at very high doses. There's no other way to get enough of it through to be effective. This is why those medications then have complications elsewhere and can cause more severe side effects. Admittedly, the question between which is worse, some side effects or fungal meningitis, it generally always falls on the side of some side effects are better. How the fungus gets through the brain to cause this is a question though. Fungi generally aren't exactly among the class of things that can pass freely through the blood-brain barrier. So how does it get in there and then spread to cause systemic inflammation? The answer is surprisingly direct but effective. The fungi build up in adequate numbers and density to be able to block off blood vessels. blood begins to build up pressure in that area, and eventually the blood vessel bursts. When this happens, you no longer need to worry about the blood-brain barrier. You've literally blown a hole through it. And this is how the fungi can get into the brain. In this case, we're talking specifically about Cryptococcus neoformans. While the research is somewhat handicapped by having been performed in zebrafish, the clinical signs seen in these animal models are the same in what's found in autopsies of people who have died due to the same disease. That is, those vessels being burst open and the lining over the brain called the meninges becoming inflamed. Still talking about the brain, but going from clinical to psychiatric. There is a disquieting association between a cat parasite and the increased prevalence and probability of psychoses in men. The parasite in question is something that we have mentioned quite some time ago in another video. It is Toxoplasma gondii. This is a rather peculiar parasite with its own odd pattern of behavior to be spread. It goes something along the lines of going into cats, altering the urine so that it attracts rodents, having the rodents then be infected by it, alter the rodents so that they don't exhibit the normal fear behavior of urine and similar things from felines, and then have them consumed by the feline, and then repeat the cycle. This odd life cycle is something that has occasionally led to infections of humans, but because the infections in humans don't get dealt with, it gradually increases in number, and so it's currently estimated that up to half of the human population has Toxoplasma gondii in their brain. Assuming a reasonable distribution as per normal populations, you would expect that nearly half of men would have this particular parasite in their brain, and if there is an association, as the article claims, there is a very big problem. As with other studies of the kind, it is possible to say that this is not necessarily the most absolute and definitive conclusion. One of the problems is that it is based on a sample set of about 2,200 individuals. These had a self-reported pattern of certain behaviors, and the variables that they derived found that cat ownership alone, which would have led to the Toxoplasmosaa infection, was not the only factor. There were others that they believe either had a synergistic effect or may also explain this. Going from psychiatry and parasites to purely onto parasitic type organisms, specifically bloodworms. These are marine animals that are small tube-like creatures. If you aren't going to look closely at them, they are seemingly rather harmless. Odd and unusual looking, but otherwise harmless. The problem is what's in their mouth, so to speak. It is a copper metal type fang almost. And this fang can also inject a venom that paralyzes its prey. It has to have prey because it is carnivorous. That makes it really odd. Metal teeth are very unusual, and how it develops these metal teeth was, at least before this study, somewhat of a mystery, with theories and some evidence building up, but no definitive way to explain what was happening. The researchers believe that there is a similar phenomena going on in these teeth for the bloodworm as there is for human bones to an extent. It involves the use of a protein, in this case something called the multitasking protein. It helps to act as a network and mesh in which things like metals and other minerals can be deposited. This is the same sort of function that collagen and other proteins have in human bone. By incorporating this multitasking protein, they can then include metals, minerals, and similar, just like human bones. This fundamentally has the same effect, except it's for their teeth and it includes a metal. In a manner of speaking, the way it behaves is like reinforced concrete. The metal within it doesn't provide structural strength so much as it holds everything together and provides tension. By doing so, even if there are minor breaks and damage to the concrete, it continues to provide the structural strength it's required to provide. In fact, the researchers are looking at this not just in terms of how it's done in this organism, but can we extrapolate from this mechanisms and methods to apply them to more commercial or industrial prospects? Things like building, for instance. Is there a way to use a similar mechanism to provide structural strength in something that is otherwise difficult to build? Finally, we have the Large Hadron Collider. This has been shut down for the last 3 years for maintenance, upgrades, and ultimately due to the pandemic. This means that some of the most groundbreaking research in physics wasn't able to happen. This is necessary, and while only originally planned for 2 years, was extended to 3 years. 2 years were necessary not just because it's a complex piece of machinery, but it is a 27 kilometer long complex machine. This means 27 kilometers of checks, upgrades, and so on. Not something that can be done very quickly or very easily, for something that needs to be very sensitive and is very delicate by its nature. The 2 major upgrades that have occurred can be found in the end site of the experiments, that is the detector. It's intended to give better quality data and allow for better selection of data that is being generated, as the sheer volume can't be maintained indefinitely. The second is to increase the amount of energy that can be put into the system, thereby increasing the speeds and allowing them to be broken down harder than before. This will in theory mean you can get more specific detail on both smaller molecules, and you can hopefully get something larger to break up into smaller things, thereby giving you more samples to work with. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.